Hey everybody, welcome to my latest video. And the vast majority of the videos on this channel, for those of you who have watched other ones, are specific software tutorials, but I occasionally post some other editing and post-related things, and this is going to be one of those. I found in the comments section of a lot of my videos that one of the things that comes up the most is questions about why this editing platform or why that one. It's usually someone who really likes one particular software and is asking why someone would use another one, usually in relation to some challenge with that software or some difficulty somebody had posted about. Honestly, I'm not sure how many of these are just people trolling versus legit questions. Most of these comments come on the Avid tutorials and are posted by people who love Premiere or Resolve and are wondering why anyone would bother with Avid. If I wanted to be particularly snarky, I'd note that you don't see a lot of this the other direction, apparently because the people using Avid are busy editing and don't have time to troll the Premiere users, while some of the Premiere junkies have nothing better to do than watch Avid tutorials and then comment about how much better Premiere is. But I don't think these are all trolling comments. It's definitely something my own students ask about sometimes as well, is why this software versus this one. So I thought I'd tackle this today, and for anyone who's curious about the differences and what might work best for them, hopefully this helps you out. All of this is, of course, my own perspective, and the biggest thing I can say for any editor is it's not about the tool you're using, it's about your creative approach and how you use it to tell stories, and that's the most important thing. Truthfully, all of these programs can do 99.5% of the same things, so at some point it's about personal preferences and what differences are most important to you that help you work the most smoothly and efficiently and in a way that makes sense to you. You can do the same stuff in any of them, but you might find certain things or certain ways of working are easier in one than the other, so find the way that works for you and do that. If you're a good creative editor in Premiere, you'll still be a good creative editor if you switch to Avid and vice versa. If you don't have a good sense of rhythm and story working in one program, switching to another program is not going to solve that. So in some ways, this is almost focusing on an irrelevant question because all of the software can do the same thing. You can edit good movies in all of them. That said, I think there's reasons why you might want to work in one or the other given your own tendencies, your own preferences, and the environment you're working in. If you're already well versed in one of them and working well in that, great, stick with it. But if you're just starting out and trying to figure out what software you want to learn or what might work best for you, I think it can be useful to understand the differences between them and figure out what will help you make the most of your creativity. Now I'm showing here the logos for Avid, Premiere, and DaVinci Resolve, all of which have editing functionality, and I've gotten comments about all of them and posted some tutorials on various aspects of all of them. But for purposes of this video, I'm going to focus on Avid and Premiere because to me, again, my own personal views, DaVinci Resolve just isn't quite there yet. Now, full disclosure, I don't have much experience editing in Resolve, although I use it all the time for color grading. Obviously, it's great for transcoding and exporting, and honestly is hands down the best of the bunch when it comes to color grading, which is why I do my color grading in there. Pretty much every project I finish in Resolve for that reason, although I do my editing and sound design elsewhere. So it's a great piece of software, I use it all the time, but in terms of straight up like classic picture editing, meaning organizing footage, putting clips together, tweaking cuts, and so on, in my own limited experience, I just haven't been impressed. It's not as user-friendly for really detailed editing as Premiere or Avid, although it's perfectly capable of stringing together some clips quickly, and I'll sometimes use it for that. Now I get that DaVinci Resolve is free, and I often recommend it to students for that reason alone, so if they can't afford an Avid or Adobe subscription, or don't want to, or aren't going to do a lot of editing and just need something on their own computer, it's great. That's fantastic. I don't know Blackmagic's business model, how they make that work, but as long as they're going to offer it for free, go ahead and take advantage of that. Nothing wrong with that at all. But I just don't think as a pure editor, it's at the level of these other two in terms of just being a pure editor. So I'm going to focus on these other two. And really, these are the two big dogs of picture editing at this point. You know, Apple's Final Cut used to be in there, used to be Avid and Final Cut. And then when Apple, I would say, destroyed Final Cut, some people might say reimagined it into Final Cut X, basically lost that market share at that point, and that was kind of taken over by Adobe. That's a whole nother story I won't get into here. You can certainly find information on that elsewhere, or if you have questions about that, post in the comments and maybe I'll respond with a lengthy history lesson about it. Anyway, these are the two big ones in the United States right now. So I'm going to focus my discussion on these two. Again, both of which are perfectly fine editors, can do all the stuff you need to do, and in terms of capabilities are very similar. It's really about the interface and how you work with them where the differences come in. Now, full disclosure, I'm probably a little biased. Anyone who's watched this channel regularly could tell you I'm an Avid editor myself. That's what I tend to post more tutorials about. I know Premiere very well. I've taught it for years. I've edited a couple short projects in it. I put tutorials on my channel about it. It's just not my jam. Every time I cut something in it, I get annoyed by Premiere and go back to Avid. But again, that's my personal preference. And what I want to lay out here is some more objective things. Kind of here's the advantages of each and kind of what they do well and where the challenges can be so you can make an informed choice for you. So we'll start with Avid. And I'm going to kind of focus on objective structural advantages of one over the other as opposed to personal preference, which definitely factors into this, but that's something only you can kind of know what your needs are. So number one, if you're working in a multi-user environment, Avid is really just better designed for this. It was designed for originally working in post-production houses where you might have multiple editors coming in, sitting at the same station over the course of the day. And so it's much better with individual user preferences and switching between them and updating all your keyboard shortcuts and window configurations and everything to go with that. So if you're in an environment where multiple people are coming in and using the same system, Avid is just designed from the ground up for that, whereas Premiere is really designed for a single user environment, although you can obviously have multiple people working on it. It's much less convenient to kind of change all the preferences and everything to go with that user. Related to this, and I think really related to the fact that Avid comes out of a pro environment, that's what it was originally designed for, whereas Premiere was originally designed for the home user. Some of these differences come from being built for those different environments. So this is another one where just Avid has a huge advantage over Premiere if this is something that's important to you, which is basically any project you create in any version of Avid opens in any other version. There might be a couple things that don't come through. For instance, let's say I was doing a project today and I put in some particular visual effect that didn't exist in Avid 10 years ago, and I open it on a 10-year-old version of Avid. The project will open, all my cuts and stuff will be there. It's not going to have that effect, or it might do something weird with it because it doesn't know what that is. But essentially, your project opens and you can access everything in any version forward and backward. I have projects from 20 years ago that I have needed to open for some reason, and I've been able to open them in my current version just fine. On the flip side, I've been in some unusual lab environments where you have versions of Avid that maybe haven't been updated in 6 or 8 years. And I can take a project that was done in a current version of Avid, open it in those, work on it just fine, save it, and bring it back to my current version. Everything works just fine. Any of you who have worked in Premiere in a situation where you might be moving between versions, so my students often run into this, for reasons I'm not really aware of, the academic site licenses versions of Premiere, so like what our university gets and sort of puts on our lab computers, is like 1 year behind the version that students get if you buy an individual license. And Premiere is not friendly about changing versions. So if a student's been working on a project at home and they try to bring it into the computer lab, it won't open. And one of the things that annoys me immensely, partly because I work in an environment with a lot of students trying to move projects between a lab and their home computers, is this isn't just like major version changes like you went from Premiere 2022 to Premiere 2023 to Premiere 2024 or something like that. Even point changes. So it was like 2024.0.1 and then you get 2024.0.2. Well, now that project you did there won't open in Premiere 24.0.1. And that's just insanely frustrating if you ever have to move projects around. If you're always just working on your own computer on your version of Premiere and that's the only place your project is ever going to live, this isn't an issue. It doesn't make a difference to you. If you do have to send projects to different people who might have different versions of the software, or you're going to be moving the project between a home computer and a lab computer, or you're going to a post house and you're not sure what version they might have, this can be an issue. I love the fact that in Avid, I've literally never had to worry about this. Every project just opens in every version. Okay, efficiency. This is a big one for me, and I'll admit here we might be getting a little more subjective, but I'll try to explain what I mean about this being a structural advantage and not just my own perceptions. If you've watched any of my other tutorials, you probably already know I'm big on working quickly, working efficiently, and that doesn't mean rushing creative decisions. It means I want to spend as much time as possible on the creative aspects of editing and thinking about the story and trying out different ideas of how something might work, and less time pushing buttons or like, I know what I want to do and how long does it take me to do that. So I'm big on what's the absolute fastest way I can do the thing once I know what I want to do. This is why I'm big on keyboard shortcuts and often shouting those out in my tutorials. And to just kind of be blunt about it, Avid is built around the keyboard. You can honestly almost work without ever touching the mouse if you want it, and that's just faster because everything's always right there. You don't have to take time to move the mouse from one place to another. You hit a button and something happens. And yes, Premiere has gotten a lot better with this than it used to be. You can do a lot of things now with the keyboard or some combination of the keyboard and mouse that used to be just mouse, but it's still fundamentally designed around dragging and dropping and moving things around with the mouse, which is fine. That makes a lot of sense to a lot of people. And I'll talk about that when I get to the advantages of Premiere. but that's different than it just kind of being the way it was built from the ground up. I also know people will say, hey, you can customize the keyboard shortcuts in Premiere, Resolve, and make them similar to Avid. And there's layouts out there like, hey, here's how you can set your Premiere keyboard to be closer to Avid. And if you're coming from Avid into Premiere, that's not a bad idea for making that transition. And honestly, vice versa. If you're coming from Premiere into Avid and you want to customize your Avid keyboard to better match what you're used to in Premiere, there's nothing wrong with that to make you work more efficiently. It can ease the learning curve moving from one to the other. But customizing Premiere to get almost the same level of keyboard shortcut access, and you still can't quite get there as you can in Avid, to me is kind of like, well, why would I spend all this time trying to tweak this system to do something almost as good as what this other one already does right off the bat? Now, I should also say this is one area where there's a big difference between the pros who are doing this all the time and kind of the everyday editor. I've seen very fast professional Premiere editors who really take the time to learn every shortcut and all the things you can do quickly with keyboard buttons or a right click on a mouse instead of dragging things. And they can work a lot faster than even a lot of pretty decent Premiere editors. So that is something where it can make it a lot faster if you really take the time to dive in and learn that stuff and get really efficient at it. But there's also some point where the software is designed around using the mouse a lot. And I see even a lot of experienced professional editors who still work that way because that's what the UI encourages you to do. There's nothing wrong with that. That's how Premiere is built and they're kind of using it the way it's built. Whereas in Avid, it's kind of the reverse. There's a lot you can do using the mouse and going into menus and such, but the UI really hides a lot of that stuff. It really wants you to use the keyboard. And I know there's been times I'm teaching and someone's like, hey, is there a way to do this with the mouse? Or like, what menu is this under? I'm like, I don't know. I haven't used that in a menu in decades because it's this keyboard shortcut and you just always do it that way because that's the fastest way to get to it. I'll also say, since I mentioned you can customize the keyboard in Premiere, which you can, this is a personal preference thing depending on how much you like to customize things, but I'll say the customization options in terms of shortcuts and your interface and your workspaces are easier to work with in Avid. I think they're a lot more accessible and quicker to change. I think Premiere is kind of wonky in how it wants you to update those, but you can do it. You can customize a lot of these things in either program if you're willing to dive into it. Number 4, trim mode. And this is called trim in Avid. I forget off the top of my head what this is called in Premiere. It might be roll edit, but it's the thing where you're looking at an edit and seeing the end of one shot and the start of the next shot, and you're tweaking the exact place where that cut happens and adding a frame here, subtracting a frame here. This may be personal preference, but I just think trim mode in Avid is much better designed. It's much quicker, more robust, and more flexible. Now, this may be one of those things where if you really learn all the deep shortcuts in Premiere and go and customize some of your keyboard settings and stuff, you can get it working close to as well as in Avid. But Avid just works so well in trim mode right out of the box. And I will say my own workflow, I spend a ton of time in trim mode. So this is a biggie for me that I can get in and out of there, move between cuts, customize which tracks I'm cutting on, and then do the trimming very, very quickly, very efficiently, usually just with the keyboard the whole way through. And because I spend so much time in trim mode, the fact that trim mode works so well in Avid is a huge advantage for me. Speaking of customizing what tracks you are trimming on, I really like the active and inactive track controls in Avid. You can think of kind of turning tracks on and off for what you're affecting. It's not the same as locking a track, which is a different function in Premiere, but particularly when you're doing some of this stuff with a keyboard, it's controlling which tracks are getting affected when you do certain things. This does exist in Premiere. It's kind of half executed where it doesn't affect everything you do, and particularly when you're doing things with the mouse, it usually doesn't affect it. Whereas in Avid, it's crucial, and Avid is really built around doing things based on which tracks are active and inactive. Now, this is something that's often confusing in Avid to people who are coming out of Premiere if they're trying to transition into Avid or learn a second piece of software, because it's something you're not used to thinking about because Premiere doesn't really rely on these, even though it does have that functionality if you use it a particular way. Whereas, like I said, it's really baked into Avid and really crucial to almost everything you do, knowing which tracks are active and inactive. Now, this could be a personal preference thing that you like this or don't like it. And I know a lot of Premiere editors who don't really like it and want to work without thinking about that. But I do think the way that it's implemented in Avid is much better and more robust because it affects everything instead of just affecting certain things depending on how you're doing them. So if you like using active and inactive tracks and having that type of control, then Avid might make more sense for you. If you don't like using those, then even though that functionality exists in Premiere, you can really get away with ignoring it most of the time in Premiere. And the last one here is interfacing with other programs. And there's going to be a corollary to this when I go through the pros of Premiere. But interacting particularly with Resolve and ProTools, and ProTools is still within the industry the audio post software that's used 99.9% of the time. Resolve, as I mentioned, is used a lot for color grading, although people use other things as well. If you're trying to bring your edit into those to do your sound design or to do your color grading, Avid just has this down and everything just works. Now, Premiere does allow things like XML and AAF and OMF export to move from Premiere into these programs or move from those programs back into Premiere, and most of the time they mostly work. But I've been working with students using Premiere for a long time, and it seems like every new version they release, there's some little quirk or weirdness that comes in with how they're doing their exports and imports between different programs where things don't quite work the way that they should. Or at least don't quite work the way they should 100% of the time. And that's something that drives me really crazy, is when I have a workflow and I test it and it works most of the time, and then sometimes it doesn't, and it's not clear why that same workflow suddenly doesn't work. So I'll just give you an example from the current version of Premiere as I'm recording this, and this is based on things that happened in my class last semester as we were trying to go through this. If you had recorded your video and audio separately, as we usually do in professional production, and you use the merge clips function in Premiere to sync your video and audio into single clips, which is a pretty common way of doing that, works fine for editing in Premiere. But in the latest version of Premiere, when you try to export to an AAF to go into ProTools, it doesn't properly find the media because it doesn't know how to break that merge clip back into the original clips. That's ridiculous. Now, Premiere is a professional level program and there's always workarounds, and I was able to find one for my students who ran into this problem. They ended up using an OMF instead, and that worked. And I've yet to see a sequence that I haven't been able to get from Premiere into Pro Tools or into Resolve. So it's always something you can find your way around, but it's just annoying to have to continually find these workarounds. And again, over the years, I've seen every version of Premiere seems to introduce different bugs into this part of the process, which is really frustrating when you're finished with your edit. You're like, okay, I'm ready to go to these other programs and do my sound design or do my color. And instead of doing that, you're troubleshooting and trying to find your way to solve this problem that should have been solved long ago. It's just more of a headache than it should be, and there's always something that's changed, whereas Avid just always works. I'm not saying no one has ever had an export issue with Avid or some sort of problem, but it's usually something you did wrong or did weirdly. Like if you're doing the right workflows, Avid just works. Now, sometimes those workflows have their own quirks, and you need to know to check this box or uncheck this thing or whatever. So I'm not saying that there's not challenges there as well. But once you have a workflow that works, it just keeps working, and I don't worry about when I update Avid, is this workflow suddenly going to be broken, which I do with Premiere. I can go ahead and update and still be confident that the same workflows I've been using are still going to work seamlessly. And that's a biggie for me in the post world. I like my workflows to work, and I like to be able as a teacher to tell my students, okay, if you do this way, this will work, and it will work every time. And that's not the case with Premiere, and particularly because they keep fixing some bugs and introducing different ones. I have to do my research every time a new version comes out and figure out what are the pitfalls here and update what I'm telling my students. And then next year, if they update their version of Premiere, whatever I told them might not work anymore. So those are all things where I think Avid has an advantage, but there are some things that Premiere has going for it as well. This is one of the biggest things I've seen people comment on the Avid tutorials I've posted about why would you use Avid, is that Premiere does allow you to just start editing without transcoding, or it can be transcoding and making proxies in the background. Whereas Avid, most of the time in most workflows, wants you to transcode your footage first and then start editing with it. Now, if you're like me, I generally do my transcoding overnight, or I plan around that into my schedule, copy all my footage in at night, start transcoding, it's done in the morning and I'm ready to work. I'm perfectly happy myself spending a little more time on the front end to know everything's going to work smoothly the whole rest of the way through a project. But if you want to just quick throw a couple of clips in and do a couple of minor trims, Premiere can be faster because you can just throw your clips in and start editing without going through that transcoding process. Or even if you're going to go through transcoding, you can let that process of making proxies happen in the background while you've started editing, and Premiere is very seamless about kind of switching back and forth between your proxies and your original footage once those proxies are ready. So I do think this is an advantage, particularly when you have a quick turnaround on something, or if you're the type of person who really, as soon as you have your footage, just has to start editing it immediately and isn't willing to wait a little bit while the clips transcode before you start working with them. So this is obviously a subjective thing, but I think I can say with some authority based on decades of teaching editing that Premiere has a lower bar for entry. For most people, it's easier to get started in Premiere because they're used to using the mouse, drag and dropping things, and it's a little more intuitive coming in what you're supposed to do and how you're supposed to do things than I think Avid is. I've taught both Premiere and Avid for years, and Final Cut a lot of years before Premiere, and Final Cut and Premiere worked pretty similarly, and in this particular issue are very similar relative to Avid. Over those years, I'd say about 80% of students find Premiere or Final Cut easier to jump in and get started with, and only about 20% Avid makes more sense. I happen to be part of that 20%. I actually started out editing pre-digital, editing sort of deck to deck and on film, but when I first learned digital computer editing, I started in a program called Edit DV, which was terrible and is now defunct, and then Final Cut Pro, and then Avid. So it wasn't like I started in Avid. I had started in a couple of other programs and always found them kind of problematic, or they weren't doing what I wanted them to do. And then as soon as I got introduced to Avid, it was like, oh, this makes sense. This is what I've been trying to do all along, and now it's just doing it instead of trying to stop me from doing what I'm trying to do, which was my feeling with Final Cut. But I am in the minority. And honestly, I think this ratio is shifting even more towards the Premiere Final Cut model than Avid. My guess, this is just speculation, is that we're getting so used to apps and everything being drag and drop and just click on a button and it does whatever you wanted it to do. And the idea that there shouldn't be a learning curve for things, you should just be able to jump in and start using it without knowing what you're doing. Premiere is more on that side. I still think you need to learn how to use Premiere, particularly how to use it correctly so that you don't run into problems down the road. But it definitely is a little easier to come in, see what to do, and have it just do it. Whereas Avid, it feels like there's more you need up front to get you going before you can start editing. So that's an advantage of Premiere. People enjoy that you can open it up and with very little instruction or know-how, just get editing. Whereas Avid, if you start doing that without knowing what you're doing, you're probably going to run into problems or get stuck somewhere pretty quickly. Again, I really think there's as much to learn in both programs. And if you are planning to be an editor, whatever tool you're using, Premiere, Avid, Resolve, whatever, take the time to get proficient at it and really learn what you're doing, and that will pay off. But that said, Premiere, you can get started and gradually pick up more as you go, whereas Avid, I think you need a little more under your belt right off the bat to just get you started. Effects and sound editing. Look, I'm going to admit it. Personally, this is not a big deal for me. I'm kind of a dinosaur. I came up in the era when picture editing and VFX and titles and sound design were all separate jobs. And even though I learned how to do all of those, I still consider them in my head separate, and I use different software for each of those. Like, I don't want to do my sound editing in Avid or Premiere. I want to do it in ProTools, something that's designed for that and has the most capability and makes it the easiest to work with sound. So personally, this is probably one of the reasons why I like Avid, is because it is really designed for picture editing, and it can do sound editing, it can do effects. Again, the capabilities of all these programs at this point are very similar, but it's kind of buried in Avid and not really all that well designed, whereas Premiere makes this a lot easier. I think even for simple effects that I do use frequently, like a resize or a split screen, I think Premiere's UI gives easier access to these and a friendlier editor for how you're working with them than Avid. And if you are somebody who likes to kind of be doing all this at the same time, I want to be doing some of my sound editing and putting in these crazy effects while I'm still doing my creative picture edit, Premiere is much more built around that model than Avid is. And again, you could do it in both, but for something like that, I would rather be working in Premiere where I get easier access to all this stuff and a, I think, better interface for interacting with and editing your effects and things like that. Okay, I talked about Avid being better at interfacing with ProTools or Resolve, moving projects from one to the other there. Premiere, unsurprisingly, is better at interfacing with other Adobe programs. So if you're using a bunch of other products in the Adobe suite and moving your project or parts of your project from one to the other, Premiere makes that a lot easier. I'll say my own perspective is this is probably the biggest single advantage of Premiere, especially if you're doing something that requires a lot of After Effects work. I know there's one project I worked on a few years ago that was edited in Avid. We did the visual effects in After Effects, and it worked fine. You can make things interface, you can make it work, but that was kind of the one project where there were times where it was like, man, there's parts of this that would be much easier if we were working in Premiere, just kind of moving back and forth between After Effects and your editor through it. You can always do it, but it's just not as seamless. So if you do a lot of projects where you're bouncing back and forth among different Adobe suites, Premiere is probably a better choice. And again, the biggest example of that for me is things that require a lot of After Effects work. If you're doing things where you're like bouncing into Adobe's color grading program, I'd suggest go into Resolve. Instead, it's free and it's a better color grader, but if that's the one that you know and you like using that, okay, then it's easy to bounce back and forth between those. So the last thing I want to mention, kind of big picture thing in comparing these two, which isn't so much good or bad as just what makes more sense to you, is just kind of a difference in philosophy of how they work. I mentioned that Avid came out of the professional world and Premiere more came out of the consumer world, and they're both perfectly capable of doing professional level work. I'm not saying Premiere is not professional. I'm saying that's not the path it came out of to start with. And I think those origins show in their design in both cases. The best analogy I found is kind of that Avid is built trusting you know what you're doing and it's just going to do exactly what you tell it to do, even if that's probably not what you actually wanted it to do. Kind of built for the professional. We're going to assume you really know what you're doing, and anything you want to do, it's going to go ahead and do it, putting the onus on you to make sure whatever you're telling it is actually what you want it to do. So every option's available all the time and just a keyboard click away. If you want to accidentally throw your whole sequence out of sync because you didn't notice that one of your audio tracks was inactive, no problem, Avid will do that, and anyone who's spent any time in Avid has done exactly that at some point. Premiere, on the other hand, again, I think this is because it comes out of that consumer world originally, provides more of a safety net. It'll do what it thinks you probably meant to do and try to protect you from mistakes like throwing your whole sequence out of sync. That can be great, and I found working in Premiere and working with students, they make fewer unintentional mistakes in Premiere than they do in Avid, because Premiere holds your hand and protects you. If you're not quite paying attention to something, it's going to say, 99% of the time when people are doing something like this, this is what they meant to do, even if it's not quite what you're trying to do, and it'll go ahead and do that. The downside is that these guardrails take a bit more getting around when you actually want to do the weird thing like throw your sequence out of sync or replace the audio but not the video in a section or whatever. Again, you can absolutely do them. The capabilities are all there, but that thing that might have been one button push on Avid now takes several button pushes and a mouse click. So it's really a trade-off of the Premiere model of having a safety net where it's easy to do the stuff you're doing 95% of the time and you're less likely to screw stuff up, but then that last 5%, you have to do some additional work to get the software to let you do it. Or the Avid model where 100% of the stuff is easy to do, but then it's on you to make sure you're actually doing what you meant to do because the software is not going to protect you from yourself. I don't think either of these is objectively better than the other. This is very much a matter of personal preference, but I think it's useful to understand that kind of difference in philosophy. No surprise, I personally like the Avid model, and honestly, every time I'm editing in Premiere, I pretty quickly end up getting annoyed because I want to do something that it's not letting me easily do. But there's a totally legitimate argument that the Premiere model of having a safety net and protecting you from making stupid mistakes, even if it requires a little extra work when you're doing some of those more unusual things or things it doesn't expect you to be wanting to do. Both of these can make sense, and it's really a personal preference of what makes sense to you. Either way, I think there's value in knowing which setup you're in so you can take advantage of its pros and be aware of its potential cons. If you're working in Avid, you got to know it's going to let you do anything and it's going to do exactly what you told it to, so you have to be really aware of things like which tracks are active and which tracks are inactive. If you're working in Premiere, you can know you've got that safety net and worry less about some of those accidental mistakes that can be easier to make in Avid, and just be aware like, hey, there's certain things you're going to do that you have to be okay with. It's going to take you a couple more clicks or an extra mouse move to make this happen. In the end, whatever you're the most comfortable with that helps the system get out of the way and let you focus on your creative decisions is the right choice for you. And honestly, unless you're planning on being a full-time professional editor where you might get offered some jobs that require you to use one software and some jobs that require you to use another, it's probably not worth the time investment to learn multiple systems. Instead, spend that same amount of time getting more proficient and learning all the details and quirks and shortcuts of your preferred system. Get really good at one instead of kind of mediocre at both. At least that's my recommendation. Again, if you're planning on going into the pro world, then there is some potential value to learning multiple systems because particularly in the world of television, you might get hired to a job and that job requires you to use whatever software they're already using, so your projects will interface with everyone else's. But for most people, if you're watching a tutorial on what's the differences between Media Composer and Premiere Pro, you're probably not yet at the level where you are getting hired regularly as a professional editor in multiple systems, because then you would already know. So hopefully that's still useful information for most of you. So that's it. I hope that was helpful. If you have further thoughts about the pros or cons of either of these systems or think I missed something, or you have follow-up questions, go ahead and post them in the comments. I'll respond where I can. And if there's a lot to talk about, maybe people post a lot of other pros and cons that are worth discussing, maybe I'll do a follow-up to this down the road. In the meantime, happy editing, and I'll see you next time.